These two glazes look really similar. They both look like nice matte glazes, and one of them definitely is a nice matte glaze. The problem is that not both of them are matte glazes. One of these holds a secret. Now, it gets down into some of the problems that we have with matte glazes in ceramics because we need to understand what a matte glaze is and what it isn't, because there are matte glazes, there are underfired glazes, and then there's our friend here. Have you figured out which one it is? You see, the glaze on the right is not a matte glaze, it's a crystalline glaze, and crystalline glazes are really interesting. Now, everybody has in their mind what they think about crystalline glazes, those big starburst crystals, and those definitely are crystalline glazes, and we'll talk about those in a minute, but this is a crystalline glaze too, but how can that one glaze have these two different appearances, and how does it differ from our other glaze here? And that's a really, really huge thing to understand to make the most out of your studio and to get glazes and to work with glazes that do what you want them to, and that's what we'll talk about today. Hi everybody, I'm Matt from Ceramic Materials Workshop, and welcome to Cracking the Kiln, our YouTube series where we dive into some of those specific and odd things about glazes that you may not be aware of, but will help make your studio a lot better. So today, we want to talk about matte glazes versus crystalline glazes. Now, before we talk about either of them, we have to talk about glossy glazes, because glossy glazes are really where the story begins. Now, glossy glazes are what they say, they're glossy, right? They are a smooth reflective surface, and glossy glazes are pretty simple to understand because glossy glazes are glass, right? We understand that about glazes is that they're just glass. They're glass we're making up from raw materials versus glass that we're buying that's already been made from the same raw materials, but we make it up with raw materials, we apply it as a thin coating to a pot, and then we get a fully melted glass out of the kiln. And that's pretty simple to understand, and the chemistry of them is complex, don't let me undersell it, but that's not exactly what we're here to talk about today. But glossy glazes, we understand we're completing a chemical reaction, but takes place at a certain temperature, and that makes a glass, and that's nice. That's what we're aiming for. But those of you who have ever had glossy glazes go wrong will know that this is not always the case, and that's the first thing that we need to understand. Of course, when we're talking about any glaze, we need to complete that chemical reaction. And if we don't complete the chemical reaction, the glass has not formed to its final composition. And that final composition is non-negotiable. I know a lot of people think of, oh, I can fire this a little bit colder and it'll be matte, and that really isn't true, at least not technically and durability wise. So here is a glossy glaze, and I made the one batch of the glaze, and I dipped 4 different test tiles and I fired them to 4 different temperatures: cone 10, cone 8, cone 7, and cone 6. And this is a really important thing to make a distinction with about glazes that are underfired yet look like they're matte. Okay, and this is a really big deal. Anyone who's ever had a kiln that didn't get up to peak temperature will have seen this before, where your kiln doesn't make it all the way to the end of the firing, so you let it cool down, and you go back and open it up, and the glazes are kind of melted and kind of glossy, but definitely still have a texture. Well, that's because the chemical reaction is not done. These glazes are intended on being glossy, and they did not get all the heat that they need. Now, it might seem like they're almost there, but we need to really understand what firing temperatures really mean. You see, when we're talking about firing temperatures, that's the temperature at which the chemical reaction is complete. But the melting process itself, a lot of people assume that it's taking place during the entire firing process, and that's not true. The melting of our glazes only takes place during the last 100 degrees C, that's 180 degrees F, of the firing. All the rest of the time in the kiln, we're just building up to the point where that chemical reaction actually happens. It's the same way how, like, you turn on a pot of water and for the longest time it's not boiling, right? The boiling reaction takes place at 100 degrees C, 212 F, but you have to build up the heat to get there. Our glazes are exactly the same. We're just building up heat till we get to the end of the firing, which is when the melting takes place. And this is a huge deal because although it seems like cone 10 and cone 6 are really similar temperatures, they're actually quite far apart during that actual melting part. Cone 10 firing is going to be 1285 C, which is in Fahrenheit. And that is, considered high temperature. Well, cone 6 is 1222 C, which is in Fahrenheit. And that difference is massive. When we're only talking about the last 100 degrees C of the firing, well, that's a 63-degree difference. That's 63% less heat than we need for the cone 10 firing. So at cone 6, we're just at the beginning stages of the melting, and yes, it's somewhat glossy, but it's still all of those minerals that made up the glaze composition going through the melting process, so they haven't had a chance to melt and smooth out. So the glaze will have a texture, and it will be matte via texture, but it's not matte via chemistry, and this is a really important distinction. If you have a glaze that gets glossier when you fire it hotter, warning, it is not a matte glaze. It's a glaze that's being underfired. And I don't care what the recipe says or what it said on the website or whatever. That glaze is not a matte glaze. That is an underfired glaze. And like I said, they're all over the place. There are websites full of underfired glazes that are quote unquote matte that absolutely are not. And that's where we really need to get into that distinction of what is a matte glaze. Now, a matte glaze is a glaze that has a texture, but there's a nomenclature problem even with the word matte. You see, matte out in the non-ceramics world means something that's not glossy, right? And that's a bit strange, but it's just you've got a glossy thing and a not glossy thing. So you go to the paint store, or you can buy glossy paint or matte paint, and matte paint has a texture, and the texture part is true. But in chemistry, matte glazes have a very specific difference. Matte glazes are glazes that were glossy, that were fully melted, but then crystals grew inside of them because of an instability in the chemistry. But the fully melting part is important. We can see that this glaze ran, and that's actually a really good sign and fairly common with matte glazes, because glazes only run for two reasons. One, they are too thick. Thick is just gravity, right? Thick things are always going to move down to the earth. Two, they are overfired. Overfiring will force a glaze to run. And three, they are too thick and overfired. So if a glaze is fully melted, it can run, and it's being slightly overfired, which is the case on this one. And that's okay, but that's actually a good sign. But so a matte glaze can run, but a matte glaze, more importantly, is not just matte because it's got underfired minerals in it. It's because it's growing crystals. But how can we identify that? This glaze is one of mine. It's very popular. You can find it on Glazy and all over the ceramics internet. And this is the Katz-Burke matte. And this is a matte glaze at cone 6 I developed with my student Anna Burke many years ago. And this is a really robust, true matte glaze. And when I say it's a true matte glaze, I mean it's a glossy glaze that crystals grow inside of. And that's a really important distinction. Now, again, if you're not real familiar with glaze chemistry, you may be like, well, how do I know? Great news, everybody. We've got the answer, because glaze chemistry tells us what glazes are going to do. More specifically, this part of glaze chemistry tells us what glazes are going to do. And this is Stull's map. We don't get into all the details right now, but Stull's map is the tool that allows us to predict what a glaze is going to do simply by looking at its recipe and converting its recipe down to its chemical parts. And we call that the unity molecular formula. So if you take a glaze, convert it into chemistry, and then plot it on Stull's map, it tells you what a glaze is going to do. And very simply, we can see we've got things like this. Here in the middle, it says bright. Bright was the word Stull, who created the map's word for glossy. So we can see a glaze that falls in the glossy region is going to be glossy. Then over to the left of that, we've got a region that says semi-matte and a region that says matte. Well, that's where matte glazes, and the distinctions between semi-matte and matte are kind of irrelevant, but that is where we are going to grow crystals inside of our glass because of what's going on inside the chemistry of it all. So when we look at the Katz-Burke matte here and we plot it on Stull's map, where is it? Right there on that edge of the matte semi-matte region, meaning that we have a true matte glaze. We have created that crystal inside of our glass, which is going to give us the texture, but also the durability of a true matte glaze. Now, how do we know what that crystal is? We have to get a little bit nerdy about it. So this is what's called a phase diagram, and phase diagrams show what happens when we combine certain molecules and heat. And more specifically, what we know is that matte glazes exist right here in the middle of the phase diagram, making a crystal called a northite. And that's literally the chemistry of the crystal that grows inside our matte glaze. We're growing a northite crystals, which are a combination of calcium, alumina, and silica. Now, why they grow in northite crystals is pretty cool. You see, a glass has a specific composition. It can take so much silica and so much alumina and so many fluxes. But if you have more of any of those in your composition, they need to do something in our glass, but there's no room in the inn. There's no place for those excess materials to exist. Well, when we have a matte glaze, we very specifically have excess alumina. And when we get to the end of our firing, the glass is fully melted and the alumina is just fine. But as the kiln shuts down and begins to cool, all of a sudden that alumina needs to find a partner to go home with. It is not going to go home alone. And so it looks around and says, well, I'm not welcome in the glass. Hey, you excess calcium, and I'll take a little bit of silica. Let's all get together and make a crystal so that we can find stability. And the crystal that a matte glaze using calcium forms is a northite, and that's specifically the crystal that we get. And it's gonna do it exceptionally consistently. Matte glazes don't care about how hot you fire them. These are all versions of the Katz-Burke matte, and they are just fired to different temperatures, and you see that the glaze is running. Well, glazes only run because they're too thick or overfired. This is an example of the glaze being overfired. This is a glaze that works best at cone 6, and when you fire it at cone 7, it starts to run really badly because you're dropping the viscosity of the glass and it starts to flow, and that's a good sign. Matte glazes should be able to run because they're fully melted with crystals growing in them. The other thing that you might hear about certain types of glazes, specifically matte glazes, is that they really benefit from slow cooling. That is not true with matte glazes. If you have a matte glaze that falls in the matte region of Stull's map, it does not care how that glaze is cooled. It's the instability of the alumina that's forcing the crystals to grow, and they're gonna happen no matter what, because that alumina is there. And if it does not have a place to go, it is going to find a place to go, and that is forming those crystals. So matte glazes on Stull don't care about slow cooling. Crystalline glazes care about slow cooling, so let's talk about crystalline glazes. Now, the term crystalline glaze people hear, and they often think of work like this. And this is a pot by my friend Ian Childers, and this is an amazing glaze, and it's a beautiful crystalline glaze. But this is not all crystalline glazes. You see, this community who makes these types of glazes has claimed the name crystalline, but these are very specifically zinc silicate crystals. And that's really important because it is zinc being used in these glazes that allows them to grow these very, very large, distinctive crystals. But there are a lot of different crystalline glazes out there that all form crystals for exactly the same reason. They just form different shapes of crystals. This you can see here, where on the left we've got a zinc silicate glaze and they're growing the big starbursty crystals. But the glaze here on the right is definitely a crystalline glaze. It's just that the one on the left is using zinc in it and the one on the right is using calcium and magnesium. Now, calcium and magnesium will grow crystals just fine, and they're the same floating in the glass level of crystals. They're just very, very small crystals, but there's nothing wrong with that. You don't need to justify the size of your crystals, crystalline community. It's not about the size of your crystals, everybody. It's how you use them. But it does lead to one really important distinction that we need to lay out, because a lot of people want to call the big crystals macro crystals and the smaller crystals micro crystals. And no, sorry, you don't get away with that one. One of my favorite books and one of the Bibles of ceramics, Ceramic Glazes by Cullen Parmalee, says specifically this, that macrocrystalline glazes are glazes in which the crystals are large enough to be readily seen by the naked eye, and that microcrystals are crystals which you need a microscope to see. Well, I can see both of those crystals just fine with my naked eye, meaning both of those are macrocrystalline glazes. Thank you very much. You know what a microcrystalline is? A matte glaze, because those crystals are so small and dense that you cannot see them without a microscope. And here's a microscopic image of matte glazes. They are definitely crystals, but they're different chemistries of crystals for different reasons, and that is a really, really important distinction. Just the calling of the smaller crystals microcrystals, I think, really throws people off about what they need to understand about crystalline glazes, because the big crystals and the small crystals all exist for the same reason and behave the same way. They're just different qualities of crystals. The quality of the crystals does come down to what alkaline earth fluxes are in your glaze. The zinc silicate glazes use zinc. We could also make crystals from magnesium or from calcium. Now, glazes do use the alkaline earths strontium and barium, but we can't use those in crystalline glazes. They're too big and logy to form crystals. I like to say it's like trying to have a whale breakdance. They're not the right size, and it's not in their nature to do that. And strontium and barium are not going to crystallize, but zinc and calcium and magnesium will crystallize just fine. The next thing you need for a crystalline glaze is that you need the right chemistry. And that means, where does it fall on Stull's map? This is a very important distinction, and this is something that my wife Rose and I discovered in our research, that in fact there is a secret region on Stull's map where all crystalline glazes exist. The zinc ones, the calcium ones, the magnesium, some other ones we'll talk about in another video, but all crystalline glazes exist down here in what we call the crystallization zone, which is very low on the map in the glossy section, not in the matte glaze section. And that is a really, really important distinction, because it's the different chemistry of crystal that's forming in a crystalline glaze with some different variables than matte glazes. And understanding the difference is going to be a huge deal. Now, when we are down in that region, we don't form a northite. When we come back to our phase diagram here, we're actually going to form wollastonite, or as the phase diagram says, pseudo-wollastonite. But it's still wollastonite, which is just calcium and silica. There's no alumina in there. Now, that might not seem like a huge distinction, but this is a major distinction. This is what makes the different crystals form for different reasons. It's a different crystal. It has different chemistry and different behaviors because of it. And because of that, we can see behavior like this. These are the same glaze. This is a glaze in our glaze book, Test 7,500 glaze test, and this is a glaze of ours called Purple Rain. And this is what happens when the glaze gets fired a little bit cooler versus a little bit hotter. That the same glaze will make more crystals in the cooler firing on the left and fewer crystals in the hotter firing on the right. And this is where that huge confusion comes from, because a crystalline glaze that makes too many crystals will be matte via texture, but it is not matte via chemistry. And that's a really important distinction. Now, the first thing that I need to say is that this throws a lot of our international friends off, because in a lot of the world, they don't fire to cone 10 as the peak temperature. They only fire to cone 8. Now, I don't agree with that as a behavior for vitrification, but again, another conversation for another time. The bigger problem that it makes is that the colder you fire a crystalline glaze, the more crystals are going to form. And the hotter you fire a crystalline glaze, the fewer crystals are going to form. And this can create a big problem when your basic firing temperature is colder than what most of the world is firing to. So there are a ton of glazes in the UK and in the EU that are only being fired to cone 8 that many people will call matte glazes. They most definitely are not matte glazes via chemistry. They are crystalline glazes that are over-nucleating. This may sound like a semantic difference, but this is incredibly important, and one that I beg the ceramics community to start paying attention to, because to just call this a matte glaze is going to confuse people as to how to work with this glaze and the variables that we need to be aware of that we're going to talk about here in a second. Whereas a true matte glaze doesn't care about firing temperature. It's going to be matte if you overfire it. It's going to be matte if you fire it a little bit cooler. It just may run or not. But crystalline glazes are totally different. They're incredibly sensitive to peak temperature. And they're not just sensitive to peak temperature, they're sensitive to minor variations in recipe and chemistry, to how they cool, to how thick they're applied, to what clay body they're applied to. Crystalline glazes are a beast with a major number of variables that can make or break your satisfaction with your work in the studio. But let's just talk about that peak temperature again. Let's go back to a zinc silicate glaze here, and this is all the same glaze. I just made 8 tiles and I fired them at increasing temperatures. So we're going up in 10 degrees C, we're starting at about cone 6 and we're going to over cone 10 every 10 degrees C. Well, the version at cone 6 at 1226 here looks matte, quote unquote. It's matte via texture, but not matte via chemistry. It is an over-nucleated crystalline glaze. But as we fire hotter and hotter and hotter, we see that we are getting fewer and larger crystals because we're dissolving more of that calcium into the glaze, so it's making less total crystals, until we fire so hot that we don't form any crystals at all. And this leads to one of my truisms about crystalline glazes. If you fire too cold, you're going to get too many crystals, and if you fire too hot, you're going to get too few crystals. And when you have a crystalline glaze, getting the perfect number of crystals is exactly what you're aiming for. Now, some of you might want to have a completely homogenized overnucleated surface. Fine, that's your choice. But if you have the same glaze and your kiln goes a little bit hot, you get these types of distinctions that the glaze is going to be very different from firing to firing, and that's what a crystalline glaze is going to do. Now, like I said, if you like it, I'm not like trying to glaze shame you, everybody, but it's going to be consistently inconsistent, whereas the true matte glaze is always going to be the same. It's really not going to care. The last thing we really need to talk about here is the firing cycle, because that is definitely important. Not just the peak firing, but the steps you take in the firing. You see, traditional zinc silicate crystalline glazes are known for a firing cycle like this, where you go up to your peak temperature, then you allow the kiln to crash cool, and then you sit at a lower temperature, something like cone 04, and that's to allow the crystals to grow. If you took a kiln with a matte glaze and a crystalline glaze and a glossy glaze next to each other, and you open them up at peak temperature, they would all be glossy. No crystals would be formed at any of those, because we need the temperature to start dropping and for the ingredients in the glaze to start looking around and going, oh no, we're about to solidify, we've got to do something. Well, the glass will form the glass, and then the crystals will form the crystals. And that is true for a true matte glaze too. Those crystals will form in the cooling. It just doesn't care how you're going to cool, they're going to do it. But with a crystalline glaze, there are temperatures at which those crystals grow. For the zinc silicate glazes, we know that those are at cone 04, so what most people will do is that they'll just allow the kiln to crash down to cone 04, and then they'll just hold there for however long they want, allowing those crystals to grow as big as they want. And the longer that they hold, the bigger the crystals will grow. But for non-zinc glazes, those using calcium or magnesium, that's not how most people do it. What most people are going to do for calcium or magnesium crystalline glazes is do what's called a slow cool. And a slow cool is allowing the kiln to keep firing, but that the temperature is gradually going down through that point where crystallization happens. And that's generally from about 1150 C to about 850 C and this and that Fahrenheit. But whatever that is, that's when we're going to get the crystals to grow. And we can see that here. Here's another crystalline glaze. And on the left is a natural cool, and there's no crystals to be seen. They're actually there, but they're so small you can't even see them. And then on the right is the exact same glaze, just in a slow cool, allowing those crystals to blossom and bloom as it goes through the firing cycle. Again, one of those things that will benefit. As I said earlier, matte glazes do not care about slow cooling. Crystalline glazes 100% care about slow cooling, and so making sure you're treating the glaze correctly is going to make a major difference in how that glaze performs. Now, there are a million slow cool firing cycles out there, and you can use any of them. They're all basically the same thing. Some of them will pause here and hold there and, whatever. This is my basic slow cool firing cycle. It's the same concept as the crystalline cycle. You go up to your peak temperature, allow the kiln to crash down to about 1150 C, and then you slowly go down. I go at 50 degrees C per hour, down to about 850 C. It takes about 6 hours for the cooling cycle, and that's how I got those crystals in that glaze, by just giving the chance for crystals to grow throughout that firing. You can do whatever you want with them, but that'll get you a good level of crystal growth with that crystalline glaze. Well, that's enough for now. There's so much more to talk about these subjects because this is a very, very complex subject, but I hope we provided a little bit of clarity for you on the difference between matte glazes and crystalline glazes. Now, if you want to learn more, we would absolutely love it if you joined us at ceramicmaterialsworkshop.com for one of our online classes or workshops where we really have the time to go into all of the details of this in depth and so much more. It's where you can learn everything you need to know about the technical side of ceramics, from basic glaze chemistry to complex glaze chemistry to clay bodies. We have an entire class crystal ball just on crystalline glazes to learn the details of these, because there's so much more to learn, and we'd love to have you join us at any of those places. If you like what we do, we've also got our podcast For Flux Sake, where we have a great time with my wife, Rose, and our partner, Kathy King, being stupid and smart about glazes, and that is a totally fun place to be. And if you really enjoyed what we're doing, please tell all your friends, enemies, and social media about us. Please post this video anywhere you can. Please give it a like and a share and all of those different things. And if it's within your means, please support us on Patreon. Ceramic Materials Workshop only exists because of your support, and your ability to support us on Patreon allows us to keep creating all of this content to hopefully make the ceramics community as smart as it can be. So until I see you next time, everybody, have a great time in the studio.